In the second half of this chapter, we are going to continue to take a deep dive into what research is, in addition to looking at different concepts in research itself. These include ways to classify research articles, what constitutes evidence, the scientific method, quantitative versus qualitative research, and interventional versus observational research, along with variables. You can classify ways, however, there are two main subtypes: primary and secondary. When we talk about primary research, we're talking about the original source of data from a single study. Primary research is data which is obtained firsthand. Researchers collect data directly rather than depending on data collected from previous studies. Examples of primary research include randomized control trials, case control studies, and experimental studies. Secondary research, on the other hand, is a second-hand review and analysis of data from primary research. Secondary research involves compiling and analyzing existing data from a variety of sources. Conducting secondary research often saves time and money while allowing us to gain a deeper insight into the subject we are researching. Secondhand research looks at the broader picture instead of the results from a single trial or study. Examples of secondary research include narrative reviews, scoping reviews, systematic reviews, and meta-analysis. Tertiary sources gather information from both primary and secondary resources. This type of source is often distant and often oversimplifies a topic or distorts it in another way. This type of source is not peer-reviewed and typically is not reliable in the way secondary research is. Examples of this type of source include textbooks, encyclopedias, and Wikipedia. While textbooks are credible, they often miss new insights into a topic. Because of this, secondary research is going to be the best type of research to use in evidence-based practice. When we think about what constitutes evidence, we think about the quality of evidence. When we look at this pyramid here, on the lower end, we will notice these are often observational studies. As we move up the pyramid, experimental studies are found in the center, and towards the top are critical appraisals and meta-analysis. In practice, we want to search for evidence that can be found towards the top of this pyramid, as it is typically more reliable and better conducted. However, in nutritional research, we will find that there are certain types of studies and types of evidence that are not found, such as randomized control trials, for the sole reason of them being unethical to conduct in practice. Research starts with a question. It's often based on an observation, something that you might see in practice, something that you might learn about in class. This then leads to a review of the literature or the current research of that specific area. Maybe once you start looking, you're going to find a clear answer to this question and no additional study will need to be done. Or maybe you're going to start to identify different gaps in that current research. This is going to help you identify your problem statement you are going to solve by conducting research. This also helps you develop a hypothesis and determine an objective. The methods of a research study can be determined and implemented by clearly formulating a hypothesis. Once you properly identify and implement your methodology, this information will help you to either accept or reject your hypothesis. Hopefully, at the end, these results are shared with others, ideally experts in your field, through peer-reviewed journals. This way, others can critique and review your research so that a higher quality of evidence is created for others to view in the future and moving forward. In the previous slide, I talked a lot about hypotheses, and hypotheses are going to be very important for quantitative research. However, qualitative research is a bit different and does not actually contain a hypothesis. Hypotheses are important in the quantitative research, and most of that research that you're going to find in the field of nutrition does actually fall into this category. Qualitative research in the field of nutrition is not as common. However, due to the complexity of many new and arising problems, these studies are becoming more popular than in the past. Qualitative research does not contain a hypothesis, as I said. However, it does provide insight into a more complex problem. These studies then help us identify different variables important for future quantitative research and can help us develop a theory. On this slide here, I would like you to take some time on your own to compare quantitative and qualitative studies. I want you to think about, the general information, what goes into a quantitative study versus a qualitative study. What are the strengths of creating a quantitative study versus a qualitative? What are the weaknesses? And then come up with some examples. What kind of studies are examples of a quantitative study? What kind of studies are examples of a qualitative study? And why might this be the case, in the field of nutrition compared to another health-based field? Let's discuss the difference between interventional and observational studies. So, when we talk about interventional or experimental studies, these are typically clinical studies in which participants are assigned to different groups. We typically have an experimental group and then a control group. The experimental group is going to be the ones receiving that intervention, while the control group is going to be receiving either a placebo or no intervention at all. Researchers then evaluate the effects of the interventions on different biomedical or health-related outcomes. In an observational study, there is no intervention happening, which means researchers are not putting any independent variable or manipulating the situation in any way. Instead, they're kind of just sitting back, they're observing, and they are taking notes and theorizing on what might be happening within this group of individuals. Two different types of observational research include descriptive epidemiology and analytic epidemiology. So for the descriptive epidemiology, this typically, it's an attempt to describe a specific phenomenon. It does not attempt to explain the cause and effect or to test any type of hypothesis. In analytic epidemiology, this is an attempt to explain the relationship and the independent variables involved. Variables are characteristics such as BMI or social support. They're measured, controlled, and manipulated in research. These variables, again, they're examined, they're described, they're interpreted, and they vary from study to study and subject to subject. Categorical variables or discrete variables only come in a fixed number of values. For example, obese, overweight, normal, underweight, dead, alive, versus continuous variables. These can really fall more on a spectrum and anywhere between a theoretical minimum and maximum, like birth weight, BMI, temperature, height. When we talk about independent versus dependent outcome variables, the independent variables are not affected by any other variables in that study. The dependent variable is often the focus of the research study itself. I want you to think about the effect of diet on blood pressure, which is the independent and which is the dependent variable. In this case, the diet must be the independent variable and blood pressure must be the dependent variable because blood pressure is dependent on what an individual is consuming in their diet. The last type of variable we're going to discuss is an extraneous variable. Now, this is any variable not being investigated that has the potential to affect the outcome of a research study. In other words, this is not the dependent, this is not the independent, and this variable is not controlled. Often, these are neutral characteristics of an individual in a study. Sometimes age can be that, or gender, features of the environment, such as noise, lighting, can all be considered extraneous variables.